World War III seems inevitable. A matter of when, not if. But why will it ignite? And who holds the match? Western alliances, built on colonial partitions and Cold War brinkmanship, now entangle 32 NATO states while they try to militarize the Pacific via AUKUS. Forward bases and cyber grids are designed as shields, but double as sparks. The very systems meant to prevent conflict now form a lattice of tripwires. Their security architecture stretches around the world, making every crisis a stress test while we wait for something to snap. In this video, we'll explore 3 possible flashpoints that could lead to World War III. But before we do, it's OPSEC time. Let me show you something real quick. Google your name. Odds are some of your personal information comes up, right? If I search my name, it's just my public social media accounts. Want to know why? Because I use Aura, the sponsor of today's video. If you've ever wondered why you're constantly harassed by spam calls, texts, and emails, here's why. There are companies called data brokers whose sole purpose is to find and sell your data. They do it without your consent, and they make billions selling it to marketers, scammers, and even stalkers. And while they're legally required to remove your info if you ask, they make the process confusing and difficult on purpose. This is why I'm always recommending Aura to family and friends. They take care of everything for you. They remove your data from these sites, and they keep it removed. Aura is an all-in-one digital security tool. You may already use some other basic app, but not using Aura is like locking the front door, but leaving the back door wide open. And Aura doesn't just fight data brokers. They alert you if your personal data is found on the dark web, they provide real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 identity theft monitoring, secure VPN, antivirus, parental controls, password manager, credit checker, and more. And if somehow something does happen, Aura includes $5 million in identity theft insurance, and they have US-based fraud experts on call 24/7. If you're anything like me, I'm sure you're sick and tired of these stupid, evil little companies stealing your personal information and using it to make a quick buck. That's why I use Aura. It keeps me and my family safe online. If you're ready to protect your data, you can get 2 weeks absolutely free when you use our link. During those 2 weeks, you'll see exactly where your data is being leaked and who's doing it. Give it a try. I promise you'll appreciate the peace of mind. Now, back to the show. To see how we got here, we're going to run through a timeline which starts in the 15th century. We'll start way back in 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal was the first agreement between European nations to divide the non-European world to legitimize later colonial conquests. This treaty serves as the genesis of Western European exceptionalism as foreign policy. 1602. The Dutch control over half of all European shipping tonnage. Their first company, VOC, also becomes one of the first multinational corporations. Capitalism is born and spreads throughout Europe. 1689. The nascent bourgeoisie flex their political muscle. They establish parliamentary supremacy and create a Bill of Rights which enshrine the consent of the governed, due process, and free speech. With monarchs and nobles weakened, bourgeois political power becomes entrenched. 1776. Capitalism still lacks a theory. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations changes that. Smith introduces the concept of self-regulating markets driven by individual interest, division of labor, and minimal state interference. 1884. European powers meet in Berlin to carve up Africa. The Congo Ocean Railway sends resources directly to markets, feeding industrial and military growth. The West begins to work together to control the world and the extraction and sale of raw materials. 1944. Western powers institutionalize global finance. They create the UN, where the power dynamics of 1944 were encoded in the Security Council and are still at work today. The West, especially the US, cements their hegemony. 1949. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is created as a permanent anti-communist military alliance, explicitly linking American foreign policy with European territory. Europe becomes almost entirely dependent on the US for defense under Article 5 of the treaty. 1955. The USSR creates an alliance known as the Warsaw Pact to counter NATO, an organization the Soviet Union rightly saw as a threat. This creates a siege mindset in Russia regarding NATO encirclement, emanating from intervention in the USSR stretching back to the Civil War period in the 1920s. 1999 through 2021. Central and Eastern European states rapidly joined NATO and the EU, reviving tensions with Russia. Regional alliances such as the Quad and AUKUS are similarly created to contain China. The West enlarges NATO and ultimately surrounds Russia while creating similar, smaller alliances against China. Now, what tools do the West and US use to hold on to power? Military bases outside one's own territory are staging grounds and geopolitical outposts. In Djibouti, for example, the US established Camp Lemonnier in 2004, making it the only permanent American base in Africa. From there, the US can monitor the Gulf of Aden, project power in the region, and watch over key shipping lanes carrying tons of products worth many billions of dollars. But the US isn't alone. NATO countries maintain similar so-called forward operating bases across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Their stated purpose is to serve as deterrence and reassurance. Then there's floating foreign policy, aircraft carriers. US carrier strike groups operate as mobile bases, each one bristling with up to 70 aircraft, guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and a nuclear-powered carrier. These war machines could generously be called diplomatic signals, or more realistically, be described as a major military threat. There is no greater exporter of arms than the West, thanks to the US. Western arms exports are often tied to deeper military partnerships and training arrangements. NATO countries often align on the use of interoperable platforms, like the F-35 fighter jet, the Javelin missiles used by Ukraine, or Patriot batteries in Poland. What we're told is that they're just beefing up defense, when really, they're becoming more dependent on the US. Attacks on more traditional financial systems, electoral databases, or communications networks can originate in one hemisphere and paralyze systems in another. Cyber attacks can hit anything from infrastructure to information hubs. Western intelligence alliances like Five Eyes have adapted to include signals intelligence and real-time threat sharing. They've gone as far as embedding cyber protocols in NATO's Article 5 framework, the Collective Defense Clause. Applying economic pressure like doling out sanctions, cutting SWIFT access, freezing central bank reserves, and imposing export controls has become a normalized extension of Western foreign policy. We saw this in real time when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. More than 30 countries coordinated sanctions, asset freezes, semiconductor bans, and travel restrictions. With that background out of the way, let's take a look at our first possible World War III flashpoint, Ukraine. The Ukraine crisis has its roots in the late Cold War. During the illegal dissolution of the USSR in the early 1990s, Secretary of State James Baker assured the Russians that NATO would not move even 1 inch eastward. And yet, post-2004, the alliance added 7 countries, including former Soviet republics, followed by 2 more in 2008. This enlargement was framed as collective defense. But defense from what, exactly? Then, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and armed separatists in Donbass, directly challenging this geopolitical shift. The next year's Minsk II ceasefire attempted to freeze the conflict, but it collapsed under unresolved territorial claims. A full-scale invasion began on February 24, 2022, with 5-axis assaults from Crimea, Belarus, and Russia itself, backed by landings near Odessa. The conflict spillover became stark in 2023 when a consumer-style drone misfired near Poland's Podlasie region, triggering a MiG-29 scramble and NATO to briefly consider invoking Article 5. Unfortunately, nuclear brinkmanship as deterrence is a factor here. NATO's B-61 nuclear gravity bombs, stationed across Europe under dual-key protocols, not only exemplify this, but could also lend some credence to Russia's claims of feeling threatened. Meanwhile, cyber attacks are becoming more common and destructive. For example, the 2017 NotPetya attack crippled global infrastructure and caused nearly $1 billion in losses. Energy infrastructure is a major target in this war. Sabotage of Nord Stream pipelines disrupted Europe's gas supply, and the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, designated a project of common interest, became a lifeline, rerouting gas from Greece to Italy. Price spikes at the Dutch TTF energy hub exposed a major flaw in the system, prompting the EU to rely on Baltic energy routes instead. When Russia banned gas to Baltic states, the European Stability Mechanism, or ESM, activated, offering loans meant to stabilize EU economies that, unsurprisingly, went to maintaining the security of the financial sector over public welfare. Now, how could the situation in Ukraine spiral into World War III? Let's consider the following hypothetical scenario. In early 2026, a cheap drone resembling commercial DJI models slams into the Lukoil refinery in the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, surrounded entirely by NATO members. The blast triggers fires visible for miles, but the real damage comes later. For now, Moscow blames Ukrainian forces, citing classified intel about the drone's origin. Kyiv denies involvement, accusing Russia of staging a false flag. Russia holds an emergency meeting with members of the CSTO to discuss invoking Article 4. Russia, ironically enough, claims the strike is an armed attack menacing territorial integrity, and demands collective defense from its allies. Belarus and Armenia step up to pledge support, mobilizing forces along NATO's eastern border. Adding fuel to the fire, Poland demands invocation of NATO's Article 5 after cyber attacks traced to a GRU unit cripple Warsaw's power grid. NATO decides to invoke Article 5 on Poland's behalf, and a response force activates, deploying troops to the Suwałki Gap, while the other Baltic states close their airspace. As the cyber war escalates, a Russian-linked malware targets Sweden, causing blackouts, mimicking the 2020 GRU playbook. EU energy grids, already strained by lack of Russian gas, attempt to reroute supplies through the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, but TAP's capacity has been maxed out, and Dutch TTF energy hub prices quadruple overnight. The ESM intervenes, imposing harsh, strict conditionality loans to prevent total industrial collapse. Meanwhile, Turkey exacerbates tensions by detaining a Russian tanker off the coast of Istanbul under suspicion of again attempting to smuggle stolen Ukrainian grain. Greece joins in and blocks exports from Sevastopol, strangling Crimea's economy. Russian naval forces stage live-fire drills near Turkish and Italian waters to serve as warning shots, while NATO submarines shadow the Black Sea Fleet. By week 3, reciprocal strikes blur the line between targeted retaliation and full-scale war. Russia tests a hypersonic missile near Romania's coast, which triggers a NATO naval blockade. China, sensing a crumbling dollar, backs Russia with loans. The ESM's austerity measures spark riots in major cities across Europe. What began as a drone strike in Kaliningrad balloons into a continent-wide mobilization, eerily similar to World War I. Now let's move on to the second possible flashpoint, Taiwan. We've discussed this from a very different angle in more detail here. Let's start with the decade-long legal pact that laid the foundation for US arms shipments, the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, or TRA. The act is more than an arms deal, but what you need to know for this video is that the US has sent $30 billion worth of arms to Taiwan since 1979. But even that guarantee traces back to December 1954, when the US and the Republic of China signed a mutual defense treaty empowering joint positioning of American forces, read bases, and authorizing Eisenhower to defend the island as he deems necessary. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the tensions in and around the Taiwan Strait, but this also goes back decades. We'll look at the second Taiwan Strait crisis that began in 1958, which saw Beijing shell Kinmen and Matsu while the US forces were distracted by events in Lebanon. Following this, there was an informal artillery duel that dragged on until US rapprochement with the PRC in 1979. Fast forward to 1996. Beijing has recalled its ambassador, fired missiles near Taiwan, and massed over 100,000 troops. This prompted the US Navy to dispatch the USS Nimitz and USS Independence to shadow the strait. Thankfully, nothing came of that incident, but it just goes to show that the tension hasn't really subsided since then. Most recently, in 2022, the PLA fired missiles over Taiwan and encircled the island with unprecedented naval deployments in response to a diplomatic visit by then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. This blend of legal treaty, crisis history, and military buildup is highly influential in shaping America's foreign policy called strategic ambiguity, a posture intended to deter supposed PRC aggression without explicitly pledging to intervene. But the wink and nod aren't exactly subtle. This seems to have changed recently. A leaked Pentagon memo reveals a disturbing focus on countering China as the exclusive threat to the US, with Taiwan's defense and homeland security framed as inseparable priorities. The memo goes on to say that the US is willing to assume risk in all other theaters in which they're currently involved. In short, losses on those fronts are acceptable. It's 2027, and Taiwan is voting on a referendum that would formally declare independence. Beijing responds by declaring naval quarantine zones around Taiwan. cutting off sea lanes and raising the possibility of an outright blockade. A few days later, a collision at sea between the USS Fitzgerald and a PLA Luoyang 3 class destroyer quickly turns into a full-on battle. In the heat of the clash, a wave of PLA drones converges on US ships, some being shot down by the Navy's Phalanx weapon system before they can strike, but those that do make it through cause enough damage to inflame the American media war machine. Alarmed by this escalation, Quad partners dispatch a rapid reaction fleet: Japan's JS Congo, Australia's HMAS Anzac, Britain's HMS Diamond, and multiple US Ticonderoga-class cruisers. They all converge on a region surrounding Taiwan in an attempt to deter further escalation. As the warships jockey for position, Taiwan's semiconductor heartland goes dark. The island's chip factories grind to a halt under the threat of heavy artillery bombardment and power cuts, likely causing a severe economic crisis and a near cessation of consumer electronic shipments. These foundries sit on the narrow western plain just 130 kilometers from China's coast, clustered near beaches US planners regard as likely invasion points. In a strange turn of events, Russia invokes a treaty from 1920 to contest Norway's authority over Spitsbergen in an attempt to defend its coal mining operations, which immediately leads NATO and the EU to scramble new Arctic command arrangements. With conflicts erupting simultaneously in the Taiwan Strait and the Arctic, crisis management channels collapse. NATO invokes Article 5, CSTO invokes Article 4, and so begins World War III. Now let's move on to Palestine. The roots of Palestine's crisis stretch back to 1948, when over half its native population, over 700,000 people, were forcibly displaced in deliberate ethnic cleansing. 531 villages razed, and entire urban neighborhoods emptied. This event is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. The United Nations response, Resolution 194, promises refugees the right to return, but Israel refuses to adhere to the resolution, and institutions like the UNRWA were not designed to fulfill this mandate, but rather simply to manage the fallout by offering temporary assistance to over 1 million Palestinians in a glorified concentration camp. Israel's latest genocidal rampage against the Palestinians has resulted in somewhere between 55,000 and 78,000 deaths, according to The Lancet. Even Israeli intelligence and the UN acknowledged the figures as accurate, despite attempts to discredit them. In March 2025 alone, nearly 500,000 Palestinians were displaced. Over 1.9 million remain internally displaced, with 80% of housing damaged or destroyed. Estimates in August of 2024 showed that Israeli forces had destroyed 84.6% of Gaza's water and sanitation infrastructure, leaving over 96% of Gaza's water contaminated, forcing people to drink sewage to survive. The latest numbers show that there have been over 669,000 cases of acute watery diarrhea as a result. But the most lethal weapon is economic siege. A 90% reduction in fuel imports cripples hospitals and water pumps, dramatically and intentionally deepening the crisis. Israel's military, and frankly its existence, is entirely dependent on the US, but they also rely heavily on precision-guided munitions, which make up 90% of their arsenal, as well as AI-driven systems like Habsora. While these systems are promoted as near-perfect, improvised rockets still easily get through and have gotten better at doing so. Now let's look at our World War III scenario. It's October 7th, 2025, 2 years since the historic Hamas-led operation, and Israel uses it to declare a complete and total evacuation of Gaza. All 1.9 million Palestinians are to be forced into the Sinai Peninsula, and those held in Israeli prisons are to be deported to Jordan. This is done over the objections of Egypt and Jordan, triggering a crisis. Egypt mobilizes 30,000 troops to Gaza's border, not to harm Palestinians, but to oppose the Israeli army and invade Israel if necessary. Israeli units attacking the Rafah border wall meet stiff Egyptian resistance. Egypt joins Ansar Allah in blockading Israel and blocks all Israeli-linked shipping, including American shipping, which spikes oil prices, hitting $200 a barrel. Europe's transport unions strike over fuel rationing. Jordan deploys forces to the West Bank border. King Abdullah warns of existential consequences, invoking Jordan's 1967 defense pact with Egypt, and they begin coordinating their attacks against Israel. Hezbollah, having rebuilt some capacity, fires thousands of rockets into northern Israel. Then, the US attacks Egypt and Jordan. From here, things escalate rapidly. Under tremendous threat from their populations and fearing the overthrow of their governments, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Arab states sever ties with the US. NATO loses Turkey as mass protests call for military action against Israel. Others follow. In the wake of these events, Iran attacks US bases across West Asia, crippling American capacity to react decisively. Iranian strikes pound Israel, while the Iranian government closes off the Strait of Hormuz to all US-affiliated trade. Already elevated oil prices skyrocket further, sparking a global economic crisis. Israel's flimsy foundations shake, and faced with rapid Israeli immigration along with a difficult military situation, Israel triggers the Samson option. The world watches in horror as Israeli nukes fly, and World War III begins. In addition to the NATO and CSTO mutual defense articles, AUKUS is now transferring nuclear submarine tech to Australia, and the Quad looks like it's moving from disaster relief to military strategy. The Indo-Pacific region is fast becoming another powder keg. Like in World War I, it appears the alliances meant to deter war are now actively preparing for it. Over 100,000 Russian troops massed on Ukraine's border before the fighting even started. NATO responded by doubling its military presence in Poland and Romania. Japan, breaking decades of caution, agreed to deploy missiles capable of hitting China. Meanwhile, Australia's defense budget surged by 113% due to unfounded fears regarding China. Behind all this is Washington's weakening grip on global dominance. Instead of retreating, the US is lashing out. Its military budget is approaching $1 trillion, magnitudes larger than any other country. Sanctions have also hit record levels, targeting allies and enemies alike, anyone who strays from Washington's dictates. Confronted with a multipolar world, the US empire is falling back on its hardline, protectionist, violent roots. The problem with stacking this many entangling obligations is that it only takes a spark to start a global conflagration. Today's conflicts can escalate in minutes, with sanctions crippling economies and missiles crossing continents. Escalatory language from alliances like AUKUS and the Quad doesn't just raise tensions, it normalizes them. In a world this brittle, the real question isn't if something will snap, but when. No one can predict the future. This video, our predictions, they're probably wrong. However, they're plausible enough to give us a glimpse at what the future could look like and who might be involved. So regardless of what is to come, we need to build our own systems based on sound, socialist principles that will outlast the chaos. Soon the global north will see their basic needs threatened in a way not seen since the Great Depression. The daily routine will go from making money to pay bills to desperately searching for food and water just to survive. The safety nets are fraying, which means that survival hinges on what we do to prepare right now.